darkness. So we know under the Roman calendar, there are 10 formal months of the year and 2 movable feast months, which really complicates things. And of course, a lunar cycle of 29.5 days being the basis for our word month, which comes from moon, as we call it now. So the Romans eventually fixed the 2 feast months in honor of the Caesars, as July for Julius Caesar and August for Caesar Augustus. So the formal calendar was then adjusted to 12 months. However, some vestiges of the old system remain in our calendar. For example, September, septus is 7, October, octos is 8, November, nove, 9, and December, the 10th, obviously. So we essentially still have those holdovers, if you will, for the months of the year. And if you think about it, we're actually still kind of doing that for the placement of Easter every year. So when does Easter occur? Anybody out here?
April.
Well, no, that's not really.
March 1st is Mardi Gras.
I'm going to pick on my associate, Professor Hanson over here. Artist, when is Easter set?
20 days after Lent, after Ash Wednesday.
Which is March 30th, so it'll be in the middle of.
So whenever we have Ash Wednesday, we have
One
Easter
moon
40
phase
days
later.
after.
Usually it's about a month before they put it out in Walmart and all that stuff. Everybody knows Easter's coming, so that's the way we have, that's how we judge it, right?
Or one moon phase before.
Well, actually, David, you're even closer.
Isn't it the first Sunday after the second full moon after December or something like, some kind of?
Well, you're close.
Something like that, yeah.
So Walmart was right.
Follow the moon.
Actually, it is the first Sunday after the first full moon occurring after the vernal equinox.
Okay, that's right.
Check that
That was
out.
more than a mouthful, so we couldn't get that far.
Right. Well, you leave it up to the
Check
church
that
to
out.
kind of set those things for you, but that system is still in effect even today.
Here's a question, why do we call it Easter?
That's a good question. I remember hearing something about that at one point. It actually went back to a Roman story about a rabbit. There's this, of course, a symbol of fertility, and estrus, I believe was the name. So it had to deal actually with the reproductive cycle of nature based on that, but I don't recall the exact thing. Yes, sir.
I believe it has to do with Ishtar.
Ishtar.
Yeah, Ishtar, the Babylonian.
Right.
So that's where the rabbit comes in then.
Yes.
With the eggs.
Symbol of fertility.
Okay.
Right.
So that's why people who have big ears have a lot of kids.
Hey, whoa. Got that on my grandmother's side of the family.
Easter
So
is
it's
named after a pre-Christian goddess in England,
Okay.
who is celebrated at the beginning of spring.
Do you repeat it?
It's named after a pre-Christian goddess in England, Estra, E-O-S-T-R-E,
Okay.
who celebrates the beginning of spring.
We love Google.
In the writings of the Venerable Bede,
The Venerable Bede. Ah, yes.
7th and 8th century.
Okay, thank you. So, researcher Robert Levine has studied the perception of time by residents in 31 different nations, ranging from the most primitive to the most technologically advanced. He proposed dichotomizing the perception of time into those cultures that respect clock time versus those that respect event time. So in clock time culture, the clock controls the start and end of meetings and tasks, while in the event time cultures, the clock is superfluous, not ignored altogether. So they would have meetings where they would say, we're going to meet when the cows come down to the stream, and the meeting will last as long as we need it to last until we get done. And that's more characteristic, actually, of island cultures and the like, and more isolated cultures that don't have a lot of commerce with the West. So Levine conducted an interesting analysis of the mean error of city clocks in 31 countries. He went and actually gathered data from about 15 clocks in a downtown area across different nations. And he looked at the error, and he also looked at walking speed and also the time necessary for a post office clerk to to give you a stamp upon the receipt of a note stating you'd like to buy a stamp. And he found that those cultures that had the fastest pace of life also had the minimal error on the clocks. So basically, the more accurate the clocks were, the faster was the pace of life, and also the higher the gross domestic product of those particular countries. There was a very strong correlation between them. So literally, time was money. So if you follow Benjamin Franklin. So according to author David Rooney, who's the former curator of the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, in his recent book About Time, A History of Civilization in 12 Clocks, which is excellent, by the way, the first sundial was brought to Rome from Sicily by the Roman war hero Manius Valerius Maximus and set in the Roman Forum about 263 BC. And with the introduction of Maximus's booty from the sacking of Catania, that sundial spread across the entire empire, although its acceptance was anything but universal, as you'll see here. Rooney was quoting a Roman playwright. He says, "The gods damn that man who first discovered the hours." And yes, who first set up a sundial here, who smashed the day into bits for poor me. You know, when I was a boy, my stomach was the only sundial. By far the best and truest compared to all of these. It used to warn me to eat whenever and wherever, except when there was nothing. But now, what there is isn't eaten unless the sun says so. In fact, the town's so stuffed with sundials that most people crawl along shriveled up with hunger. So even then, people hated the clock. But they were using it essentially for the same purposes we do today, which is to essentially create some level of schedule. So the transition from obelisks and sundials to mechanical timepieces that could operate after dark, such as the clepsydra or the water clock, appears to have a more mundane origin, however. The emphasis seems to be on creating a device, getting ahead of myself, to perform a more practical function. That of timing the deliberations of members of the legal profession, who, you guessed it, were seeking a means to charge by the hour. So according to social psychologist Robert Levine in his book of Geography of Time, the notion of the hour was still in dispute, even into the 1800s in Europe and the Americas. One of the things that's very interesting about this is the lawyers, when they would be, did I skip one page? Yes, okay. The lawyers were actually, when they would ask the judge for additional time to present their case, they would ask the judge for more water during Roman times. And when they would be challenged by the opposition would typically say, "You're wasting water." So the clepsydra was a key element, if you will, of deliberations during the Roman era in the legal profession. So, interestingly enough, a large clepsydra still exists, which is in the form of the Tower of the Eight Winds in Athens.
Hey, Bill, I don't mean to interrupt, but I heard a nice comment. Your argument doesn't hold water.
There you are. Right. Exactly.
I'll drink to that.
Water.
Now this interesting building, which is eight-sided Tower of the Winds, actually had a clepsydra in it, a mechanical device that powered an armillary sphere or an orrery or a planetarium, according to Rooney. It's located quite near the Parthenon, and it was fed by a stream, and the stream came from a spring that was actually called Clepsydra, which is the source of the name. So, to give you some idea of how old this is, this was built about 140 BC. There were 4 sundials on the outside of it so that one could calibrate the clepsydra inside. So it's probably one of your first clock towers, if you will, in the world, and still exists. So The clepsydra, or water clock, eventually gave way to the hourglass, of course, which did not suffer from the problems of evaporation or clogged apertures, or changes in pressure head or water density due to cooling or heating, but was considerably more expensive to produce. An hourglass required an attendant, of course, to faithfully turn it at the end of each hour throughout the day and throughout the night. The hourglass held sway for quite a long time until the invention of a practical mechanical timekeeper based on a folio movement intended to awaken a dozing friar to signal each of 7 daily prayer sessions for his fellow monks. There was a big problem with friars falling asleep. And in effect, what was necessary was something like the equivalent of an egg timer that would count down and ring a bell and wake him up from slumber. So you remember the children's song, Frère Jacques. How does it go? Frère Jacques, dormez-vous, dormez-vous. Son las matines, the bells are ringing, morning bells are ringing. The whole idea was the morning bells with clock. Of course, clock, which literally translates into bell, has nothing to do with timekeeper. It's basically a device to wake the monks. This was a technology that advanced significantly under the Catholic Church's direction for pragmatic reasons, with the signaling process eventually becoming automatic, and the hour chiming clock was born, a technology that is still used today. Indeed, according to Rooney and other authorities, clock technology was one of the few areas that actually advanced in Europe during the Dark Ages. At this point, I wanted to digress a moment and say a couple of words about the Antikythera Mechanism, which purportedly was made in Syracuse by one of Archimedes' students around 200 to 250 BC. How familiar are you with the Antikythera Mechanism? I'm sure almost everybody is here.
Oh yeah, everyone is. Yes.
That's unbelievable.
Absolutely.
Really?
But we'll wait for a good
Oh,
definition.
okay,
Thank
okay.
you.
Well, for those of you who aren't familiar with just a brief history, a sponge diver working an area right next to the island of Antikythera was doing collection on the ocean bottom in the Mediterranean and came across an arm sticking out of the sand. He was terrified, thought that this was the body of someone who had recently drowned. Went to the surface, and after they calmed him down, he went back down and found out it was a statue. And that the arm had become exposed, as the sand had been moved away. But in addition to that, they found this rather odd encrusted piece of material that had the outlines of gears in it. This is about 1901. It was brought back to the Athens Museum. I had actually seen this when I was in Athens last time. It's a very interesting piece. It's about so big. And it remained there for over 100 years. And as a curiosity, nobody really knew what this was. Hewlett-Packard, interestingly enough, was brought in and created a scanner for the evaluation of this technology. Make sure I don't run out of time. Which was able to go through and take slices of it electronically without disturbing the original material. And from that, they found that this device had something on the order of about 40 gears in it, and was actually a primitive computer. Actually, it was a fairly sophisticated computer, in the sense that it was capable of representing the movements of planets and the moon, the 7 planets known to the Greeks at that time. The interesting thing about it is that it would give you the precise location of these planets every day for 19 years. And as well as being able to represent them in a retrograde fashion. So in other words, when the knob on the side of this was turned, once you set the starting date, Mars would move forward, stop, and then move backwards the correct amount, and then would resume, so that all of the orbits were exactly predictable, which is no small feat when you think about it. This is doing it simultaneously for 7 planets. So all of the information that was provided by the Babylonians and the Hittites and others in tabular form and essentially been codified into this device so that it could be used as a computer. And then there were questions about, well, if you had something like this, why the devil would you want to build it? And some historians have suggested that this would be a tool for political manipulation, interestingly enough.
Democrats or Republicans?
Something like that. Well, imagine a scenario like this. You have this machine, and you can predict eclipses. And the next city over, your rival, is not nearly as technically sophisticated as you. You've sunk all of this money into paying these priests and who are your scientists, in effect, to create this thing. So I'm cranking this ahead and I'm saying, okay, there's going to be an eclipse on this date. Okay. Write out a note to the next ruler, take this over there, takes it over to the ruler, and it says, on the 15th day of the next month, Jupiter is going to eat the sun. And if you don't sign on with me, it's going to eat you. Well, this isn't going to happen. Well, okay. And then they get an eclipse. And they say, oh, God, they're right. Jupiter is on our side. So they sign on with this other. So, you can terrify the daylights out of the other guy using just psychological warfare. You don't have to lift a finger or lose any men.
Beware the Ides of March.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. And this is an exact usage of that. So there can be a lot of other things that they can do with it. Of course, now you know exactly when the Olympics need to be scheduled because why? All the planets need to align. So when do they align? You can specify the exact date, in advance, and you can put out requests for everyone to gather at that particular date. So you've got all of that at your fingertips. You don't need to necessarily go and have a scribe work through the tables and tell you it's all right there, and all you need to do is turn the knob. Okay, so anyway, this Michael Wright, actually, he was the former curator of mechanical engineering at the London Science Museum and later at the Imperial College in London, actually has recreated this. There's a wonderful video of him on YouTube where he has actually made it out of discarded brass plates from clocks and other materials. He said he did that because that would have been the way that the Greeks would have done this as well, using discarded material. It's something we know about as clockmakers. We do a lot of that as well. Nothing ever gets thrown away. We reuse wheels, we reuse plates, and so forth. So the data that's internalized in this device was believed by Wright to originate with the ancient Babylonian priests we mentioned earlier, who recorded planetary movement over many different years. The device was probably made long before the birth of Ptolemy. And as of course we mentioned, it has been extensively researched by scholars, and there are many good papers in academic journals on it. And I'm not going to go into detail on those because many cases are above my head. One of the things that I did notice with this when I first saw it was that it goes out to 19 years and no more. And one of the questions was, well, if you think back to the Hittite calendar at Hattusa, what was the period? It was a 19-year period for the female deities. Well, the reason is it didn't need to go any more than 19 years. Once you hit 19 years, everything resets and the cycle repeats. So the Greeks were pretty knowledgeable about that too. Why build a computer that goes out any longer than it absolutely has to? Now it's interesting to note that the astronomical clocks began to reemerge in Europe in the 1400s. Remember, we were dealing with clepsydra and also the development of the bell to wake the monks. But elements of the Antikythera Mechanism and the moon dials and the planetary motion start showing up on clocks such as this one, which is the Zeitglocke in Bern. I had the good fortune of having a hotel room right around the corner from this, didn't know it. went out on a Sunday morning and took a walk down the street, came around the corner and was face to face with this immense clock, which was really designed to instill social order about the 1400s. The interesting thing about it was that during the 1400s, in the Middle Ages, they had a real problem with shopkeepers and servants being at each other's throats. What they really wanted to do was to take the population and make them more temperate. And in fact, the entire term temperance, everything in moderation, comes from the word time, if you think about it. So the idea was to try to get the population working on a regular basis. Workers come in on time, they put in their 8 hours and then they go home, this sort of thing. So that you didn't have a situation where the shopkeepers were exploiting the workers, paying them for 8 hours but making them work 10 and so forth. So according to Rooney and Simon Schaefer, the professor of history and philosophy and science at the University of Cambridge, many of these clocks were performing much the same function as the original sundial brought back by Manius Valerius Maximus installed in the Roman Forum, ordering people's lives and ensuring work was performed on time and within budget. So the progression of timepieces up to the present day really reflects an evolution of technology and method, but a lot of the basic motivations for the creation of clocks remain unchanged to improve efficiency and cost effectiveness while ensuring that goods and services are delivered according to some schedule. Rooney noted that despite the creation of time zones and the implementation of standard time, it took 50 years before cities gave up their individual right to maintain local time and went to railroad time or standard time. So there was if you think we have problems now with getting people to wear masks, imagine trying to tell Tampa that it can't have its own time and Lakeland can't have its own time. They did, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why they had so many train accidents that ultimately resulted in a standard time. As a matter of fact, in Rochester, New York, around about the 1880s, there were no fewer than 3 different time zones going simultaneously in the city. The city had its own local time, but there were also one for each of the 2 railroads. The person actually made a lot of money off this was the curator, who became the curator of the Smithsonian, Langley. And Langley actually got into a financial arrangement with an observatory in western Pennsylvania. And he was using the observatory to electrically transmit time to his customers and made a lot of money off that. When you look at it in terms of why that would be necessary, well, one of them was to observe legal ordinances. Let's say that you wanted to ensure that everybody left the bar at 3 o'clock in the morning. You don't want to be in a position where you've still got patrons in there at 4 or 3:30 because you could be fined heavily. So in order to prevent that, you would essentially subscribe to Langley's electric time and ensure that you had a bell that went off to tell everybody that it was time to go home. And so these various legal leverages, if you will, were responsible for getting standard time to move out into the community. Also, factory owners who were running their own speed clocks and other tools in order to get more work out of people for less pay, were also eventually brought to task in order to ensure that people got a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. They were actually using their own clocks and adjusting them so that they ran more slowly, and the workers would essentially put in 9 hours of work for 8 hours of pay. So that kind of thing was going on. So today, of course, let's see, whether it's mechanical timekeeping or natural cycles, we still define a given cycle in terms of its relationship to other cycles, which is an interesting problem. How do you describe a minute? Whether you describe a minute in terms of its relationship to a second or in terms of its relationship to an hour. In other words, you always have to appeal to a different metric, which is based on another cycle in order to do it. There There is no way to do it in an independent fashion. So ultimately, everything goes back to, if you will, to celestial movement. We understand what a year is based upon how many rotations of the planet in order to align with a particular star. And indeed, a lot of that is still done today. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that human beings are very adept at detecting periodicities, cycles, and the like. So we all understand the rotation of the planet, the rise and fall of the sun, and of course the progression of the lunar cycle. We also understand, of course, that with very careful observation of periods of time, we can establish longer cycles, like periods of 19 years, etc. But it's really beyond the scope of this lecture to cover all the various influences for the creation of timekeeping devices, for there are quite a few. My last slide, unfortunately, appears to have been omitted from this version, but I do have references for Levine's fine book, Geography of Time, and also David Rooney's more recent book, About Time, A History of Civilization in 12 Clocks, which I'll be happy to share with you. Thank you very much.
Now you can see why I want him in charge of the museum, right?
Yeah.
Now in the museum, or our concept or idea of how the museum should be, a lot of these things would have their own room. There's a lot of things you didn't cover because there is so much to cover. The Antikythera Mechanism being one of my favorite. The math alone on the Antikythera Mechanism is unbelievable. It's astronomical. Thank you. And some of the things that the Antikythera Mechanism does, let me think, for example,